Okay, so my name's Leah, and our presentation this week was on defining prejudice and discrimination. We had two studies, and I'm going to be presenting on study one. So, study one is on the discrepancy between male and female students getting admitted into job applications for a laboratory management position. So, previous research has shown that there is a discrepancy between recruiting female and male students in academic sciences, and these sciences include biology, chemistry, and physics. These previous researchers also noted that gender bias was existing within these fields in other departments and areas when it comes to hiring those students. There was a higher preference for male students in the laboratory that was noted among faculty members, which includes both male and female members, which is important. Implicit biases and cultural stereotypes were predetermining factors in the faculty's decision, which means that cultural stereotypes of females, such as being domesticated and being a housewife, and the knowledge that males are dominant in other career forces was kind of a factor when they were viewing what makes a applicant desirable. It is also noted that science is viewed as a male-dominant field. Oh no. Oh, gotta go back. Why does it do this? Okay, so they had three hypotheses. Hypothesis A was that male student applicants would be favored in mentor willingness, higher ability, competency, and salary conferral. Hypothesis B was that the gender of selected faculty members would not have an influence towards gender bias. And hypothesis C was that the mediation for female students would be implemented in regards to being perceived as less competent than male students. For the methods of this study, participants were selected from chemistry, biology, and physics departments. Of these departments, they were selected from 3 private institutions and 3 public institutions. This study, I think, is unique because they used a smaller sample of only 127 participants, but the researchers noted that a smaller sample size was used to avoid a type 1 error for being selected in the application process. It was a randomized blind study, which means that when the faculty members received a application form, it was random whether they were given a male name or a female name. And these faculty members were rating student applications applying for science laboratory manager position. Sorry, I don't know how it keeps doing this. So when the faculty members were given the student applications, those names were either Josh or Jennifer, which are 2 distinct female and male names being masculine and feminine, so there's a distinct difference. And the participants who were judging the student applications were required to complete the modern sexism scale. And what the participants were looking for and rating students on were competency, the likelihood of hiring a student, their annual starting salary, like what amount they wanted to start the student at, and how much career mentoring they would be willing to offer the student. The results of this study showed that male applicants received and scored higher in almost all areas. That means they scored higher in competency, or at least they were judged as having more competency than female applicants. They received higher starting salaries, and they were offered more career mentoring compared to female applicants. And these are judgments from the faculty members. So the female applicants were viewed as less hireable than the male students, and the bias was found to not be limited to a specific demographic category. So that was something of note. This graph here shows in each area of competency, higher ability, and mentoring that male students scored higher on a scale of 1 to 5. And there's error bars, and there's a pretty big difference. I think the biggest difference is in higher ability and mentoring. So for the results in regards to the hypotheses that I listed earlier, the results of this study support hypothesis A. In regards to hypothesis B, it was also supported because the gender of the faculty member did not influence bias, and hypothesis C was supported as well. It was also found in this study, which is to be noted, that there was unintentional negativity directed towards female participants, so they were judged more with a negative outlook and perspective. This is another graph from the study, and I thought it was interesting because female students were started out between $26,000 and $27,000, while male students were ranked like way over 30,000. I mean, just above 30,000. So that's like a $4,000 difference. That's pretty big, I think. And for the discussion, I wanted to go over the key points. The key points for this would be that there is most definitely a bias towards female undergraduate students in the field of science academia. And both male and female faculty members deem female students undeserving of competency levels, higher salaries, and career mentoring. Like I showed the graph earlier, the difference between the salaries was pretty big, and so were all the other bar graphs. I think the most notable one besides salary is also mentoring, because mentoring is a crucial part of being a student. I think that the researchers stated that if the gender bias isn't addressed in the science field or other fields as well, it's going to place extreme disadvantages on female students, and therefore gender bias should be examined to lessen the disadvantages. The perception and credibility of female students is severely undermined. Like I said, I don't quite understand the competency portion, but apparently they unintentionally rate them as less competent than a male applicant. Cultural stereotypes, as noted in the introduction, were noted to be a deciding factor of competency and mentoring for those female students. I think that goes back to thinking that they're housewives and should be kept to domestic roles. And previous researchers assessed that male student applicants are more likely to be selected over female applicants most of the time. So due to these conditions, females are constantly at risk for harm in the academic field of science, which implies that they're not going to get scholarships as often, not going to get grants, not going to get research opportunities, not going to receive mentoring, get paid less, probably not get as much benefits and as much out of their degree. I don't blame them, but women are more inclined to leave the academic field of science, even though things like flexible work settings are offered, and there is a bit of increased identification of women involved with science, but they are still more likely to leave. Future research of pre-existing bias that lies within the field of academia should be examined, so future research should go on and examine not just with females and males, but maybe like with race too and religion, on why these biases are going to affect how they get recruited and hired and selected. I bet that there's a ton of bias towards other factors as well. Ways that this could be prevented or hopefully lessened is that they could increase women's self-monitoring of what's going on around them, and we can increase the transparency of the workers, like the faculty members who recruit them, and maybe give them scales to let them know, like, this is how much bias you have, and you should be aware of this much bias. Lastly, continued bias in all fields, but specifically the field of science, is a threat to future future research and education, because some of the women who are in science can be really great and they can pose a lot of helpful ideas, and if you keep on undermining them and putting them at a disadvantage, it could be detrimental to science as a whole. So I believe that's the end of my portion.
So for study two, hi, my name is Laura, and I am in charge of the second part of this presentation. For study two, I chose developmental antecedents and social and academic consequences of stereotype consciousness in middle childhood. Okay. Pivot to the next slide. Okay. This study focuses on stereotypes defined as beliefs about the characteristics and identifiable groups. The discrimination is taken as the negative treatment of a person or group based on the group membership. For this study, it is believed that the concepts of prejudice and discrimination develop together. Hence, one must know one to know the other. A way of thinking about race is stereotype consciousness, which basically means what characterizes others, such as ethnicity, and how conscious we are of those. We also touch base on when we actually start to think about those stereotypes and those prejudgments. When it comes to children, this refers to how the child knows they are different from one another based on knowledge that people accept, agrees or disagrees, or rejects others. Of course, with race and color ethnicities, which is what we first see as we grow up. The study actually had two goals. The first goal was to examine the relationship between individual child, family and community factors and children, stereotype consciousness. And the second goal was examine the social and academic consequences of stereotype consciousness. The hypothesis for the first goal, and at the end they all kind of like blend in together, but the first hypothesis for the first goal was individually as a child for the factor. The children from academically stereotyped ethnic groups, mainly African Americans and Latinos that were tested, demonstrated knowledge of stereotype earlier in life and at a very more, at a really early age in life, more frequently than children from academically non-stereotyped ethnic groups. The second hypothesis was family-based and family factors. More frequent parent-reported racial socialization practices, but not parent-reported general parenting practices, was associated with greater likelihood of children's stereotype consciousness. For this study, both the children were questioned and interviewed, but also the parents were asked to fill out different types of questionnaires. For the community factors, or for the first goal, greater self-reported exposure to discrimination was associated with greater likelihood of stereotype consciousness. Again, these were based on children ages 5 to 11, so it kind of depended if they already knew what that was, if they were exposed or not. Okay. For the second goal, the hypotheses were two. Children who have developed knowledge of broadly held negative stereotypes would more likely than children without such knowledge explain negative interracial interactions as expressions of racial discrimination. And then the second one, when children from academically stereotyped ethnic groups became aware of broadly held stereotypes, they themselves became vulnerable to stereotype effects that are induced by characterizing a working memory task as diagnostic ability. Okay. So for the methods here, I jumped to the results for the methods that they did.
I'll fix it. There you go.
Okay.
Sorry.
There you go. So the participants were students from the school year of 2004 through 2005. Like I mentioned, there were grades between kindergarten and fourth grade, and the ages were between 5 and 11. This school was based in a suburban Chicago school district that serves approximately 5,000 elementary school children. for these grades. The students of the school district were 56% white, 29% black, 4% Hispanic, 4% Asian, and 7% biracial or multiracial, and 17.9% were low income. Consent forms were sent as invitations as well for all of the students, the 5,000 elementary school children. Only 155 children returned the form. Out of those 155, only 124 actually participated in the interviews. The remaining 31 participants, 16 had a scheduling conflict, 8 withdrew before they were interviewed, and 7 withdrew before completing the interview. They just kind of decided to go and play instead of finishing the interview. Out of those 124 children, 52.4% were boys, 63.7% were white children, 16.9% were black, and 8.1% were Latino. 11.3% were Asian children. The measurements or how they gather the information in this study was basically from parent reporting. They reported all of the ethnicity information. They also were given questionnaires on the children to see what the IQ test they had, and if they knew verbally what they were being asked. On this scale, you can see the age, like I said, between 6 and 11. The vocabulary skill score was 3 to 19. That was the range between all of the students. They were also tested on cultural socialization, basically the parents as well. They were tested to see if they felt targeted or not based on stories that they were told. They each had a 4-story told where blacks were the target of whites, and then vice versa, whites were targets of blacks, and then they would be questioned about that. After that, they were questioned how they would relate those stories to real life, and if they felt ever attacked, for example, by name calling or just put out of a group. The test took about 45 minutes to an hour per child, and they were asked to stay after school to kind of get these results or get this testing done. Okay. And this one kind of shows how the parenting styles, because they were questioned, the parenting styles affected the children and how the exposure of racial socialization to others could also help children identify the differences between themselves and others. The parents completed a parent practice assessment, which included a 73-item parenting style questionnaire. They also have completed a 44-item racial socialization questionnaire, and the child was exposed to discrimination on 11 statements that were read to the child about events reflecting race-based teasing from personal to or viewed experiences. And like I said, the examples were like name calling with answers as true, sometimes, or not at all, or false. Okay. These are the results that were given from the test to see how broadly held stereotypes they knew. And like I said, all of these children were tested to see if they knew what they were going to be asked. A lot of the results were missing. Parents, only 100 data sheets were returned to the school or the evaluators, and they were inputted using the Norm 203 software, using only 100 parent return data. Basically, they inputted 100 data sets to maximize the statistical power based on the received responses. This study suggests that children of age 6 through 11 or elementary school age are able to infer other stereotypes, become knowledgeable about broadly held stereotypes, including conversations with parents. This can start the promotion of stereotypes and social understanding of where the child may stand. This suggests that as soon as a child or children have the knowledge of broadly held stereotypes, they are more likely to create and accept discriminatory intent to others. It also provided information for the knowledge of broadly held stereotypes can lead African American and Latino children to perform poorly on tasks that require working memory capacity when they are framed as what they are able to do. So basically, part of the study was they would read a long paragraph and they would be asked to memorize it or to repeat what they had remembered. But they were also held to a standard of poor or high depending on their race. So future studies may be performed to see how consequences of this social understanding at a young age would affect children's social and academic functioning. This study also showed that children from stereotyped ethnic groups get older and learn of others. It was suggested that after age 8, children became aware and susceptible to stereotype threats, and knowledge of broadly held stereotypes between age 9 and 10, becoming vulnerable to stereotype threat conditioning. So if they're exposed to being successful in life at a very young age, they probably will. If they're not, they probably won't. Age-related changes in stereotype consciousness were consistent with the hypothesis. Children between age 6 and 11, the majority of children were able to infer other stereotypes and were aware of broadly held stereotypes. Second, at every age in this range, a greater proportion of children were able to infer other stereotypes than were aware of broadly held stereotypes. Children appeared to be able to infer stereotypes before they were aware of the held stereotypes, especially in the older children between ages 10 and 11. Based on this, it seems plausible that exposure to discrimination could increase children's awareness of broadly held stereotypes. However, this study showed that exposure to discrimination was unrelated to stereotypes consciousness, and children from stereotype groups who do know about broadly held stereotypes will be affected by stereotype threat conditionings. And I think that's it. For the conclusion, our topic, like mentioned, was defining prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice has different layers to it, like it is to prejudice, prejudge, but it also includes the emotions behind that. Stereotypes are also included, and the acceptance of those in different cultures. It also includes like classical conditioning, and exposure to others. Okay.
So the questions that I have are for study 1, and I'm going to answer them, and also, of course, like they're open for everyone to answer and think about. So I thought, back in all the literature that I was reading for that study, it was really apparent that biases were existing towards women, both cultural stereotypes and biases. So I was kind of curious, like, what biases make the faculty member decide that they're less competent and less hireable than a male participant. And I mentioned it a lot, but I think stuff like I don't know why, because it's the 21st century, but I think sometimes there's still the notion that women are domesticated and should be domesticated and should cook and clean and have a very light job, not hard science is difficult, and so maybe a woman being in hard science is seen as non-feminine or unfeminine, and that's maybe a bias, and it's more masculine because it's a male-dominant field. Maybe that's a cultural stereotype, so that's what I thought of. And then this one I wanted to pose as a question because even I'm not quite sure. So what are factors that could limit and prevent these conditions occurring for female student applicants? It was mentioned in the discussion section that increased transparency should help, and just increasing the recognition of females in science. But I think, I don't know if this is right or wrong, but maybe seeing before you hire someone, like how much bias do you have towards this demographic group, or how much bias do you have towards females, or this certain race, or this religion. And it's not, the purpose of that isn't to, scold you or anything. I think it's just good to be aware of the bias you have, so you don't want to miss out on a good applicant. I mean, either way, a good applicant is going to help the field overall, so why would you want to miss out on a good opportunity if you could just evaluate your bias? So I think that's a good way to prevent them.
For my study, I had a few questions, and they're pretty basic. Are prejudices and discrimination learned and taught? Based on the study that I reviewed, it kind of seemed that it was a double-edged question, like double-edged sword. A lot of the parents did return the essays or the questionnaires, and based on that, the discrimination or the prejudgment of the children was from that, but a lot of them weren't. But the majority of the time it's being taught at home without knowing. So the children are learning that. And when the children learn stereotype consciousness, this was actually very surprising. It did say between the ages 8 and 10, but as early as 6, they start to know if they're different from others, or how to identify people who are different from themselves. And that's a very young age that, to me, it was a little bit surprising, and it's an open discussion, or it opens up questions of how our verbal consciousness can translate to children. But yeah.
Yeah. What did it again? Oh yeah, those are our references for, that's one. That one's for Laura's study, and this one's for my study. So yeah, that's our presentation. Let's do this one first.